The biggest lie you keep telling yourself is this: I'll start when I feel ready. And that lie was quietly shaping Ethan Carter's life every single day. Because Ethan wasn't stupid, he wasn't untalented, and he definitely wasn't lazy in the way people imagine. He had goals, big ones. He wanted to build something meaningful, get in shape, prove to himself that he could become more than who he was right now. But every morning, his alarm would ring, and instead of getting up, he would hit snooze. Just 5 more minutes, he would say, and somehow those 5 minutes turned into 30, then into rushing out the door, skipping the habits he promised himself he would build, telling himself he would try again tomorrow. And tomorrow became a pattern, not a fresh start, but a repeat of the same story. Ethan believed motivation was the key. He thought successful people must wake up feeling driven, inspired, ready to conquer the day. So he waited for that feeling. He watched videos, read quotes, listened to podcasts, and for a moment, he would feel it, that spark, that energy, that belief that this time would be different. But the next day, the feeling was gone, and with it, his action disappeared too. And slowly, something worse began to happen. Not failure, but stagnation. His life didn't collapse, it just didn't move. His dreams stayed exactly where they were, out in the distance, untouched. And one night, sitting alone in his small apartment, staring at his phone, scrolling past people his age building businesses, getting stronger, moving forward, he felt something deeper than disappointment. He felt stuck, like he was watching his own life from the outside. And for the first time, a thought hit him that he couldn't ignore. What if the problem isn't that I don't have enough motivation? What if the problem is that I only act when I feel like it? And that question stayed in his mind, louder than any motivational speech he had ever heard. Because deep down, Ethan knew the truth. Every time he waited to feel ready, he was giving control away. And every time he gave control away, the version of himself he wanted to become moved further out of reach. And in that quiet moment, without excitement, without energy, without any dramatic change, something shifted, not in his circumstances, but in his awareness. Because for the first time, he began to see that there were 2 versions of him, one that waited and one that acted. And up until now, he had been choosing the wrong one without even realizing it. The next morning, nothing felt different. There was no sudden burst of energy, no dramatic shift in mindset, just the same room, the same alarm clock, and the same familiar weight of not wanting to get out of bed. Ethan opened his eyes and immediately felt the urge to go back to sleep. Just like always, his mind started negotiating with him. You can start tomorrow. You did not sleep well. You deserve a break. And for a moment, he almost listened, because this was the pattern he had followed for years. But then that thought from the night before came back, quiet but sharp. There are 2 versions of you. And without fully understanding why, he sat up. Slowly, without motivation, without excitement, just movement. He put his feet on the floor and stayed there for a few seconds, feeling how uncomfortable it was to act without feeling ready. It felt wrong, unnatural, like he was forcing himself into something he was not prepared for. But he stood up anyway, and that small action, something most people would not even notice, felt heavier than anything he had done in a long time. Because for the first time, he was not following his feelings, he was acting in spite of them. And that was new, that was unfamiliar, and honestly, that was hard. As he went through his morning, everything felt like resistance. Brushing his teeth felt like effort. Making his bed felt like effort. Even sitting down to focus for 20 minutes felt like effort. His mind kept pulling him back, telling him this was pointless, telling him he would quit anyway, reminding him of every time he had failed before. And this was the real battle, not the work itself, but the constant voice inside his head trying to stop him. And for the first time, Ethan noticed something important. The voice never disappeared. It just got louder when he tried to change. It was not a sign that he was doing something wrong. It was a sign that he was doing something different. And that realization shifted something small but powerful inside him. Instead of waiting for the voice to go away, he started moving with it, carrying the discomfort with him, step by step, minute by minute. And by the time he finished that first small block of focused work, there was no celebration, no rush of pride, just a quiet awareness. He had done something he did not feel like doing, and that had never been his strength before. And later that day, when the old habits tried to come back, when he reached for his phone, when he thought about skipping the rest of his tasks, the same battle returned. the same resistance, the same excuses, but now there was something else too, a tiny gap between the thought and the action, and in that gap, Ethan realized he had a choice, not a big dramatic choice, but a simple one. Follow the version of himself that waits, or the version that acts, and for the first time, he did not choose based on how he felt. He chose based on what he knew he should do. And even though it was uncomfortable, even though it felt forced, even though nothing about it was easy, he kept going, not because he was motivated, but because he was starting to understand something deeper, something he had ignored for years. That change does not begin when you feel ready. It begins the moment you stop needing to feel ready at all. By the third day, the excitement was completely gone. Whatever small spark Ethan felt at the beginning had disappeared, and now all that remained was resistance. Heavier than before, sharper than before, because now his mind knew exactly what he was trying to do, and it pushed back harder. That morning his alarm rang, and instead of just feeling tired, he felt a clear voice inside his head saying, "This is pointless. Nothing is changing. You are still the same person." And for a few seconds, he believed it. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of doubt pressing down on him. Because the truth was, nothing on the outside had changed. His life still looked the same. His room was the same. His results were the same. No one around him noticed anything different. And that made it even harder to continue. Because without visible results, his effort felt invisible too. And that is where most people stop. Not when things are impossible, but when things feel meaningless. Ethan stood there, caught between two choices again. Go back to what is comfortable, or continue something that felt like it was leading nowhere. And this time the battle was not just about action. It was about belief. Do I trust this process even when I cannot see the result yet? And that question did not have an easy answer, because his past was full of unfinished attempts, full of moments where he started strong and slowly faded away, and his mind used those memories against him, reminding him that this would be the same, that he would quit again, that this effort was just another temporary phase. And for a moment, he almost gave in, almost laid back down, almost chose the easier version of himself again. But then, something subtle shifted, not a burst of confidence, not motivation, but awareness. He realized that this exact moment, this exact feeling, was the difference. This was the point where his old self would stop. And if he stopped now, nothing would ever change. But if he moved forward now, even just one step, then something new would begin, not outside, but inside. And so he stood up again, slower this time, heavier, but more intentional. And he followed the same simple rule: do it anyway, even when it feels pointless, even when it feels like nothing is working, because he started to understand that results are not immediate. But identity is built in moments like this, moments where no one is watching, moments where there is no reward, no recognition, no visible progress, just a decision. And as he moved through his day, carrying that same resistance with him, something quiet began to grow, not confidence, but trust. Trust that he could act without needing to feel ready. Trust that he could continue even when doubt was loud. And by the end of that day, nothing had changed on the outside. But inside, there was a small shift, a fragile but real change. He was no longer just someone who wanted to be disciplined. He was someone who had practiced it, even if only for a few days. And that realization planted a new question in his mind. If I can do this for 3 days, what happens if I do not stop by the end of the first week? Something strange began to happen, not outside, not in a way that anyone else could see, but inside Ethan, in the way he looked at his own actions, because the resistance was still there, just as strong, just as loud, but it no longer surprised him. It no longer felt like a signal to stop. It felt like part of the process, something expected, something normal, and that changed how he responded to it. Instead of asking, "Why is this so hard?" he started asking, "What do I do next?" And that simple shift made each decision slightly easier. Not easy, but clearer. Every morning still felt heavy. Every task still required effort. But now there was less negotiation, less back and forth inside his head, because he had stopped treating his feelings as instructions and started treating them as noise, something that could exist without controlling him. And that was new. That was unfamiliar. And yet it was working, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Ethan noticed small changes in his day. He was getting more done in an hour than he used to do in 3, not because he felt more motivated, but because he wasted less time deciding whether to start. He simply started, and that saved energy. Mental energy he did not even realize he was losing before, but the real change was not in his productivity. It was in his identity, because for the first time, he began to see himself differently, not as someone who was trying to become disciplined, but as someone who followed through, even when it was uncomfortable. And that shift was subtle, but powerful, because once you start to see yourself that way, your actions begin to match that identity, not perfectly, not every time, but more often than before. And yet, just as he started to feel this quiet progress, something else happened, something that tested him in a different way. One evening, after a long day, after doing everything he said he would do, he sat down and felt a familiar thought return. You have done enough. You can relax now. And that thought felt reasonable, even deserved, because he had worked harder than usual. He had pushed through resistance. He had kept his promise to himself. And now, he wanted a break. But as he reached for his phone, as he started to drift back into old habits, another thought appeared, just as quiet, just as simple. Is this the version of you that you are building? And that question stopped him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clear. And in that moment, Ethan realized something deeper. Discipline is not just about starting. It is about continuing. It is about the moments after you think you have done enough, the moments where you decide whether to stay consistent or fall back. And those moments are harder because they feel justified. They feel earned. And that is where most people lose their progress, not at the beginning, but in the middle, when things are no longer new, when effort becomes routine, when there is no excitement left, only repetition. And as Ethan sat there, caught between comfort and consistency, he understood that this was not a one-time decision. This was a pattern, a cycle that would repeat again and again, and each time, he would have to choose, not based on how he felt, but based on who he was becoming. And slowly, without any big announcement, without any visible reward, he put his phone down and chose to continue. As the days turned into 2 weeks, the process no longer felt new. It felt repetitive, almost boring. And that was where a different kind of challenge appeared, not resistance, not doubt, but monotony, the kind that slowly drains your focus without you even noticing. Ethan woke up one morning and realized something strange. It was easier to start now, but harder to care. The actions were becoming automatic, but the meaning behind them felt distant, like he was just going through the motions. And this was dangerous in a quiet way, because when something becomes routine without purpose, it becomes easy to skip, easy to ignore, easy to replace with something more comfortable. And his mind quickly noticed that, offering him small shortcuts. You can skip today. You have already proven. You can do it. Missing one day will not matter. And those thoughts sounded reasonable, logical even, because they did not feel like excuses, they felt like rewards, and that made them harder to reject. Ethan sat at his desk that morning, staring at his work, feeling that pull again, not the loud resistance from before, but a soft invitation to slow down, to take it easy, to relax just a little more than he should. And for a moment, he hesitated, because this version of the challenge was new. It was not about forcing himself to start. It was about choosing to stay consistent when nothing was pushing him anymore. No urgency, no pressure, just a quiet decision. And that was when he understood something deeper. Discipline is not only built in hard moments. It is maintained in ordinary ones, in the simple, repetitive actions that do not feel important in the moment, but define who you become over time. And as he sat there, he asked himself a question that cut through the noise. If I skip today, what am I teaching myself? And the answer was clear, not in words, but in feeling. He would be teaching himself that consistency is optional, that progress can pause whenever it feels inconvenient. And that was the exact pattern he had lived in before, the pattern he was trying to break. And suddenly, the decision became simple again, not easy, but simple. Do it anyway, not because it feels meaningful today, but because it builds something over time, something that cannot be seen in a single moment, but only through repetition. And so he began again. Same task, same effort, same quiet resistance. But this time with a different awareness. He was not chasing results anymore. He was building a standard, a baseline for how he shows up every day, regardless of how he feels. And as the hours passed, Nothing extraordinary happened. No breakthrough. No sudden success. Just another day completed. Another promise kept. And yet, something invisible continued to grow. Something stronger than motivation. Something steadier than emotion. A sense of control, not over his circumstances, but over his actions. And that control, even in its early form, felt different. It felt real, because for the first time, Ethan was no longer depending on how he felt to decide what he did. He was deciding first, and letting his feelings follow later. And that quiet shift was changing everything. Even if no one else could see it yet by the third week, something unexpected began to happen. The work itself did not get easier, but Ethan did, not in strength, not in talent, but in how quickly he responded to resistance. What used to take him hours of thinking, debating, and delaying now took seconds. The moment the thought appeared, "I do not feel like doing this," he no longer stopped to argue with it. He moved, almost immediately, and that speed, that reduction in hesitation, started to change the entire rhythm of his day, because before, most of his energy was wasted not on the work, but on deciding whether to begin, and now that decision was almost automatic, and that saved him more than time. It saved him focus. But with that progress came a new kind of test, one that was quieter but more dangerous, because this time, it came in the form of confidence. One afternoon, after finishing his tasks earlier than usual, Ethan leaned back in his chair and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Pride. Not loud, not overwhelming, but steady. He had kept his promises for days, then weeks, and for the first time, he started to believe that he had changed, and that belief felt good. It felt earned. But hidden inside that feeling was a subtle shift, a small voice that said, "You are different now. You do not need to be as strict anymore. You have proven yourself." And that thought, more than any resistance before, was dangerous, because it did not sound like an excuse. It sounded like growth. It sounded like reward. And that made it harder to question. Ethan noticed it later that evening, when he chose to delay one small task, just a little, telling himself it would not matter, that he could handle it later. And nothing dramatic happened. Nothing broke. Nothing failed. But something inside him felt familiar. That same pattern, that same slow drift back into comfort. And that was when it hit him. Discipline is not something you achieve once. It is something you practice daily. And the moment you believe you have mastered it, you begin to lose it, because discipline does not survive on past effort. It depends on present action. And in that moment, Ethan understood something deeper than before. Every day resets the score. Every day asks the same question again. Not who were you yesterday, but who are you today? And the answer is not given through intention. It is given through action, through the small decisions no one sees, the ones that feel too minor to matter, but quietly build or break your standard. And as he sat there, aware of how easily he could slip back, he realized that this was the real challenge. Not starting, not continuing, but staying consistent when things feel under control, when there is no pressure forcing you forward, when comfort starts to feel safe again. And instead of reacting with fear or doubt, he made a simple adjustment. Not bigger goals, not more effort, but clearer rules, non-negotiable actions that he would follow no matter what, because he understood now that relying on how he felt, even when he felt confident, was still a risk. And slowly, calmly, he returned to the same principle that started everything. Do it anyway, not because you are struggling, but because you are not. And that quiet discipline, repeated day after day, was shaping something far more important than results. It was shaping who he was becoming by the fourth week. The changes were no longer just internal. They began to show in small but undeniable ways. Ethan noticed that tasks which once felt overwhelming were now just part of his day. Not easy, but expected, like brushing his teeth or making his bed. They no longer required a decision, and that alone made everything feel lighter. But with that progress came a moment he did not expect. One afternoon, he ran into an old friend who asked him a simple question. "What have you been doing differently lately?" And for a second, Ethan did not know how to answer, because nothing in his life looked dramatically different from the outside. He was still in the same apartment, still working on the same goals, still moving forward step by step. But something had changed, something that was hard to explain, because it was not about what he achieved. It was about how he showed up every day. And as he tried to put it into words, he realized something important. The biggest change was not in his results. It was in his reliability. He had become someone who could trust himself, someone who followed through even when it was inconvenient. And that realization hit deeper than any external success could. Because for most of his life, the problem was not that he did not know what to do. It was that he could not rely on himself to do it consistently. And now, slowly, that was changing. But just as he began to feel this quiet confidence, life presented him with a different kind of challenge, something unpredictable, something outside of his control, a week where everything fell off. His schedule was disrupted, his energy was low, unexpected responsibilities appeared, and suddenly, the structure he had built was harder to maintain. The routine that once felt stable now felt fragile, and, for a moment, the old pattern tried to return, the thought that said this is not the right time. You can pause and come back later. And that thought felt convincing, because this time, the reason was real, the situation was different, it was not just laziness or distraction, it was life happening. And that made the decision harder, because now he had to choose between being flexible or being consistent, and for a moment, he considered stepping back, giving himself a break, waiting until things felt normal again. But then he remembered something that changed everything. Discipline is not about perfect conditions. It is about showing up even when conditions are not perfect. And that idea shifted his approach completely. Instead of trying to maintain the same level of effort, he adjusted, smaller actions, shorter time blocks, less intensity, but still consistent, still intentional. And that was the key. He did not stop, he adapted. And by doing that, he protected the one thing that mattered most, continuity. Because he understood now that missing one day was not just about losing progress. It was about breaking the pattern he worked so hard to build. And as he moved through that difficult week, doing less but still doing something, he realized a deeper truth. Discipline is not rigid. It is flexible but firm. It bends when needed, but it does not break. And that understanding gave him something he never had before, not just control over his actions, but resilience, the ability to keep going even when life does not cooperate. And that was when Ethan truly saw the difference between who he used to be and who he was becoming, not in perfect days, but in imperfect ones, where the real test was not how much he could do, but whether he would stop or continue. And this time, he continued by the 5th week. The change was no longer something Ethan had to think about. It had become part of how he moved through his day, not perfectly, not without effort, but consistently enough that it started to feel natural. And that was something he had never experienced before, not a burst of motivation, not a temporary phase, but a steady rhythm, a quiet pattern that repeated itself day after day. And with that rhythm came something deeper, clarity, because for the first time, he could see the difference between his past and his present in a way that was impossible to ignore. Before, his life was built on how he felt. Good days meant progress. Bad days meant nothing happened, and everything depended on his emotions. But now, his actions were no longer tied to his mood. They were tied to his standards. And that changed everything, because feelings are unstable. They rise and fall. They shift without warning. But standards remain. They give structure, they remove uncertainty, and they make decisions simpler. And Ethan felt that simplicity in the way he approached his day. There was less overthinking, less hesitation, less emotional weight behind each choice. He did not ask himself if he wanted to do something. He asked if it aligned with the standard he had set. And if the answer was yes, he acted. And if the answer was no, he adjusted. And that clarity created a sense of control he had never felt before, not over the world, not over other people, but over himself. And that control was powerful because it removed the constant internal conflict that used to drain him. But what surprised him the most was not how much more he was doing. It was how different he felt while doing it. There was less stress, less pressure, because he was no longer chasing a perfect day or waiting for the right moment. He was simply showing up, again and again. And that repetition built something stronger than motivation ever could. It built confidence, not loud confidence, not something that needed to be proven, but quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you can rely on yourself. And as that confidence grew, something else began to shift. The way he saw challenges, things that used to feel intimidating now felt manageable, not because they became easier, but because he trusted himself to handle them. step by step, without needing to feel ready. And that trust changed how he approached everything, from small tasks to bigger goals. He no longer waited. He started, and that simple habit, repeated over time, created momentum, real momentum, the kind that does not come from excitement, but from consistency. And one evening, as he looked back on the past few weeks, he realized something that would have been impossible for him to understand before. The version of himself he used to chase, the one who was motivated, inspired, always ready, was never real. It was an idea, a temporary state that could not be sustained. But the version he was becoming now, the one who acted regardless of how he felt, that version was real, because it was built through action, not emotion. And in that moment, Ethan understood the difference clearly. One version waits to feel ready, the other moves forward anyway. And only one of them creates a life that actually changes weeks later. Nothing about Ethan's life looked extraordinary from the outside. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no dramatic success, no moment where everything changed overnight. But that was the point, because real change had already happened, just not in the way he used to expect. It was not loud. It was not visible. It was built quietly, in the decisions no one saw, in the mornings when he got up without wanting to, in the moments when he kept going without feeling ready. And as he stood there, one evening, looking around his room, he realized something that would have felt impossible before. He trusted himself, not in a perfect way, not with complete certainty, but enough to know that when he said he would do something, he would at least try. And that trust changed how he saw his future, because before, his goals felt far away, not because they were impossible, but because he could not rely on himself to reach them. But now, that distance felt different, not closer in space, but closer in process, because he understood that progress was not about big moments. It was about repeated actions, done consistently over time. And that realization removed something that had always held him back, the need to feel ready, the need to feel confident before starting, because he had learned, through experience, that feelings follow action, not the other way around. And as that understanding settled in, he thought back to the version of himself he used to be, the one who waited, who planned, who hoped that one day things would feel easier. And he saw clearly now that nothing was wrong with that version. It just did not know a better way. It believed that change required the right feeling, the right moment, the right mindset. But what it did not understand was that those things are not the starting point. They are the result. And that is why it stayed stuck. And now, standing in the same place, with the same life, but a different approach, Ethan saw the difference, not in what he had, but in who he had become. Someone who moves forward even when it is uncomfortable. Someone who continues even when it feels repetitive. Someone who chooses action over emotion, again and again. And that is when the final truth became clear. There are still two versions of him. They did not disappear. They still exist every single day. One that waits, and one that acts. One that follows feelings, and one that follows standards. And every morning, without exception, both versions are there, offering a choice, not a big dramatic decision, but a small one, simple and quiet, almost invisible, and yet powerful enough to shape everything. And the only difference now is this: Ethan no longer asks himself which one feels better. He asks himself which one leads forward, and then he moves, not because it is easy, not because he feels ready, but because he knows that is the version worth becoming.